Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for this webinar is the EPA Clean Power Plan and state RPS programs. This webinar is a presentation of the RPS Collaborative. The RPS Collaborative is a project of the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and our host for this webinar is Director of the RPS Collaborative and Executive Director of CESA, Warren Leon. Before I pass this over to Warren to get us started, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants for this webinar are in listen-only mode, so that means that hopefully you can hear us, but we can't hear you. You have a couple of options to connect to the audio portion of this webinar. You can either call in using your telephone, or you can connect using your computer mic and speakers. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We will be reading through your questions as they come in. We'll get to as many as we can at the end of our presentation. We'll try to allow about 20 minutes or so for a Q&A with our guest speaker. So again, please type your questions in as you think of them. We'll get to as many as we can at the end. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded. You will find a recording of this webinar as well as all of our previous CESA webinars on our website at cesa.org/webinars. And we will also send you a follow-up email with a link to this webinar recording and to the slides. And with that, I would like to pass it over to our host for this webinar, Warren Leon.
Hey, thank you very much, Samantha. Well, this webinar is being hosted by the Clean Energy States Alliance. We're a national organization primarily of state clean energy agencies, and you can see our members shown on the screen up in front of you. One of the activities of CESA is to coordinate the RPS Collaborative. If we could see the next slide. And what the RPS Collaborative is an effort that's funded by the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy in order to facilitate interchange and information sharing among state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, and any other stakeholder who's interested in the wonderful world of RPS. We have a monthly free newsletter. We do webinars like this. We have an annual RPS Summit in Washington, D.C. You can learn about these things and sign up to get on the list for the newsletter and for the webinars by going to our website, cesa.org. And if you can go to the next slide. Well, today we have as our guest speaker Ed Holt, who really has done a lot of work on understanding the implications of renewable portfolio standards and how they interact with other policies and other programs. Ed is an expert on green electricity, and he has 40 years of experience in energy planning. He's president of Ed Holt and Associates, and in that role, he advises government agencies, utility companies, and nonprofits on renewable energy policies and markets and on green energy programs. And with that, let me turn it over to Ed.
Okay, thank you, Warren. Today's topic is the intersection of the Clean Power Plan and state RPS programs. And just to get started, I want to acknowledge and thank Warren and CESA for its support in this investigation, and also to note that these interpretations are solely my own interpretations from study of the Clean Power Plan rule and knowledge of state RPSs in general. Let's go to the next slide. Actually, you can skip 2 slides. I expect that by now most everyone is somewhat familiar with the Clean Power Plan, so I'm just going to give a very high-level overview to begin. The CPP is a rule adopted by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to reduce carbon emissions from existing power plants, specifically to reduce CO2 emissions by 32% below 2005 levels by the year 2030. It also establishes emission performance standards for most states in the form of emission rates for two categories of existing fossil-fired electric generating units, or affected EGUs as they are termed in the rule. These two categories are steam generating units, mostly coal-fired, and natural gas combined cycle units. The CPP also provides states with two alternative forms of emission goals: a statewide maximum emission rate, taking into account the specific affected EGUs in each state, and an equivalent total allowable tons of emissions per year for each state. The CPP provides interim goals in 3 steps. This is the glide path, so-called, leading to the final 2030 emission performance rates. The plan, the CPP, describes in great detail a lot of ways that states can comply with these emission goals, but ultimately it's up to the states to propose their compliance plans, which EPA will review. And if states don't propose a plan or doesn't meet EPA standard, then EPA may implement a federal rule for that state. Next slide, please. So before I go on, I want to remind you of the legal challenge, which no doubt you are also somewhat aware of. Most of you know that within implementation of the final rule, 27 states petitioned federal courts for an emergency stay. That's an order to suspend implementation of the rule. At the same time, 18 states have joined the litigation in support of the EPA's plan. The Supreme Court granted a stay on February 9, pending judicial review. So this decision to suspend implementation wasn't based on the merits of the rule. It's just saying we're not going to support implementation or enforcement at this time until those issues are resolved. Issues about the legality of the CPP will be decided by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, and likely on appeal to the Supreme Court itself. Arguments were originally scheduled for June 2nd before a 3-judge panel, but in May, the Court of Appeal announced that they would hear the challenges to the CPP sitting en banc, meaning the full court, on September 27. So that's the next date to look ahead to. So this delays the oral arguments by more than 3 months, but it may ultimately shorten the overall judicial schedule. So assuming that the appeals court ruling will be appealed, the Supreme Court will not get the case of West Virginia versus Environmental Protection Agency until 2017. EPA says that it will continue to provide tools and support for states that want to continue work on their state plans. And they've also said that the date for initial submittal of state plans, which was to be September of this year, won't be enforced, and the date for final plans will also probably slip. Let's go to the next slide. So states can choose between 2 types of emission standards plans, a rate-based plan or a mass-based plan, shown by the 2 columns in this matrix. An RPS can broadly help states meet their emission goals, either in the rate-based or a mass-based plan. The emission standards approach is just what its name implies. A state achieves compliance with the CPP entirely by imposition of federal emission standards on affected EGUs. If we look at the top row of the matrix, the blue band, we can see that the emission standards approach applies to those affected fossil generators. They're the ones who are responsible for compliance with the emission standards. Another important distinction of the emission standards approach is that the emission standards are imposed by EPA and are enforceable under federal law. In this emission standards approach, an RPS is really a silent partner. It's a complementary measure. You don't have to document the RPS itself. EPA encourages the mass-based plans because they're generally much simpler. States just measure stack emissions, and they don't have to document how they reach the goal. With rate-based plans, on the other hand, states are issued emission rate credits, or ERCs. And ERC issuance depends on measurement and verification of renewable generation or energy efficiency savings. And you'll hear this referred to as EM&V for evaluation, measurement, and verification. States that choose a mass-based approach have another option called a state measures approach, shown in the second row. State measures are programs or policies adopted under state law that can be demonstrated to reduce emissions. They must be enforceable under state law because they're not enforceable under federal law. The key advantage of this approach is that state measures that can be demonstrated to reduce emissions can be used to reduce the burden of emission reduction that would otherwise fall on the affected EGUs. As a result, the emission reductions required of affected EGUs could be less stringent because a state measure is picking up at least some of the burden. With the emission standards approach, the obligation falls on, as I said, on the affected EGUs, but in contrast, state measures may apply to entities other than the affected EGUs. For example, it could apply to utilities or other load-serving entities, and that's where a state RPS could play a more direct role. A state could choose a state measures approach to meet some of its emissions reduction goal in combination with emission standards on affected EGUs, or it could rely entirely on the state measures to meet its goal. The disadvantage of the state measures approach is that a state must demonstrate that its state measures will achieve the emission reductions on schedule, and it must describe how the emission reductions will be verified. The state must also agree that if the state measures don't do the job, the federally enforceable emission standards will be imposed as a backstop. So the bottom line is that a state RPS can help a state meet its emission reduction goals indirectly by helping affected EGUs lower their emissions, or directly and explicitly as a state measure. Next slide, please. I'd like to drill down a little bit on each of these options. For rate-based plans, EPA has created a new tradable instrument, the emission rate credit. ERCs are used to lower the emission rate of affected EGUs, and they may be issued for a variety of emission-reducing actions, including renewable energy generation. The provider of that renewable energy then can sell its ERCs to an affected EGU. And that's how the motivation of the financial incentive goes to getting more renewable energy on the grid. So in that way, an RPS can help a state satisfy its CPP goals indirectly by producing more renewable energy that's eligible for ERCs. Again, it's not the RPS itself that counts, it's the megawatt hours generated by the eligible or approved energy resources. There are two important qualifications for eligibility. The first is that EPA's final rule only allows incremental renewable energy or other clean energy sources to count towards achieving a rate-based goal. Incremental means that the generating source began construction on or after January 1st, 2013. The second qualification is that in most cases, only energy produced in compliance years 2022 to 2030 counts toward a rate-based standard. The Clean Energy Incentive Program, or CEIP, which you may have heard about, provides an exception to this vintage requirement for certain resources that produce results in 2020 to 2021. So it gives a 2-year window that's a little bit earlier. So hence, only new resources post-2012, that is by January 1, 2013, are eligible, and then it's only the generation occurring in 2022 and later that can be used to adjust an affected EGU's emission rate. Now let me make a little diversion from this slide and explain how ERCs are used. Then we'll come back to RPS and mass-based plans. Next slide, please. I think actually you went back one, so we need to go ahead 2 slides. There we go. I said that ERCs are used to adjust the emission rate calculation of an affected EGU under a rate-based state plan. Essentially, this describes how that's done. An affected EGU would first calculate its actual emission rate by dividing its total emissions by its total generation, as shown in the top equation. If the actual rate is higher than the emission rate standard for that affected EGU, the EGU must acquire ERCs either by efficiency in its own operation or by purchasing ERCs from other sources. And these ERCs are added to the denominator as zero emission megawatt hours to lower the rate, as shown in the bottom equation. A recalculation of the rate with the addition of ERCs in the denominator will show whether the affected EGU meets the emission rate standard. The ERCs used to make the adjustment must be submitted to the state regulatory body and retired or canceled. I would also note that if the actual rate is lower than the emission rate standard, the affected EGU may be issued ERCs for the difference and could sell those ERCs to other parties. Next slide, please. So now we're back to looking at how an RPS relates to other approaches to state plans. In states with mass-based plans, RPS policies can help the state reduce emissions indirectly by displacing emitting generation. The total amount of emissions from all affected EGUs is lower because the RPS helps bring more emission-free generation online, and emissions measured at the affected EGUs are lower overall. It doesn't matter if the renewable generator is located in-state or out-of-state. Even if it's in-state, there's no guarantee that all renewable energy generation used to satisfy an RPS will necessarily displace in-state EGUs because it's all part of a regional grid. On the other hand, the state may share in the benefits from another state's renewable generation. Which EGUs are displaced depends on a number of factors, such as the size of the regional grid, the types of generators available to call upon, and the dispatch order followed by the control area operator. But it's safe to say that in a mass-based plan, renewable energy, including renewable energy generated out of state, automatically counts toward meeting a state's goals to the extent it displaces in-state generation at affected EGUs. That's the operative phrase. It's not necessary to prove that a specific renewable generator caused displacement or to attribute displacement to an RPS in general, and ERCs are not issued and play no role. The state doesn't have to quantify the effect or establish a direct link between the RPS and the affected EGUs in the state. Emissions are simply measured, again, at the stacks of the affected EGUs, and it's enough that the RPS is producing emission-free energy onto the grid to help reduce emissions. A state that chooses to take a state measures approach can have an RPS count directly towards CPP compliance as long as the state proposes the RPS as one of the state measures in its plan. In this approach, a state would submit a plan that relies in whole or in part on an RPS to reduce emissions, and in most states, enforcement would be on the RPS obligated utilities or load-serving entities. The RPS may be satisfied by out-of-state generation, but the state proposing the RPS as a state measure must demonstrate that the renewable energy attributes won't be double counted by affected EGUs in other states. In any event, if a state proposes its RPS as a state measure, it must meet a number of documentary and analytical requirements. These include a demonstration that the state measures are quantifiable, verifiable, enforceable, non-duplicative, and permanent. And EPA has definitions for what's required to meet each of these standards. Next slide, please. The CPP compliance period begins in 2022 and extends to 2030. So states whose RPS targets reach their peak before before then may want to consider whether their RPS will be effective in helping to meet their CPP goals. This map highlights states with RPSs that max out before the CPP compliance period begins. 17 states reach their peak before 2022. The states in gray have an RPS with targets that grow at least into the CPP compliance period, but even most of them reach their highest target before 2030. I just wanted to focus attention on those states whose maximum target is reached before the CPP compliance period even begins. These states might want to consider whether to let the RPS maintain its maximum level indefinitely or sunset if the RPS law ends abruptly, or to increase the targets in their RPS to make it easier to meet the CPP's increasingly stringent emission goals. I noted in here with one footnote that New York has some direction to adopt a new standard of 50% by 2030, and I have not made the addition, but I saw actually in Warren's newsletter just a couple of days ago that Rhode Island passed a law which updates their RPS to 38% by 2035. So they would not be shown in this category given the adoption of that law. So to summarize these ideas, either under the rate-based plan or mass-based plans, state RPSs can continue to operate as they've done previously. States can choose to increase their RPS targets to help displace affected EGUs and thereby indirectly reduce overall emissions. States could also look to their RPSs to produce more energy that's eligible for ERCs that can be used by affected EGUs to lower their emission rates. But states don't have to attribute the reduced emissions to a particular policy unless they want to rely explicitly on an RPS as a state measure. Next slide, please. Because ERCs and allowances are tradable instruments used for CPP compliance, they have characteristics that are similar to renewable energy certificates, or RECs, used for RPS compliance. Both CPP and RPS compliance instruments are intangible, tradable, and especially in the case of ERCs and RECs, they're created based on the generation of a megawatt hour of energy. So I want to talk a bit about how the CPP's emission credits and emission allowances work and whether they're the same as RECs used in renewable energy markets. For compliance with a rate-based plan, we've already talked about how emission rate credits are used. ERCs can be created for qualifying renewable energy, energy efficiency, combined heat and power not otherwise affected by the emission standards, and incremental nuclear generation. ERCs may also be issued to affected EGUs that emit at a CO2 emission rate below their assigned rate limit and to incremental natural gas generation that substitutes for affected coal-fired generation. In comparison, a renewable energy certificate, or REC, represents the property rights to the environmental, social, and other non-power qualities of renewable electricity generation. One REC is created for each megawatt hour of renewable electricity placed on the grid. So RECs serve the role of laying claim to and accounting for the associated attributes of renewable-based generation, and they're the basis for demonstrating compliance with most state RPSs. We all know that there's a pretty strong consensus in policy and market practice against double counting RECs. Because EPA created this new instrument, an ERC, from the same megawatt hour that's used to create a REC, there's been some confusion about whether ERCs and RECs create a double counting problem. EPA tried to anticipate this issue by stating clearly that ERCs and RECs are separate instruments. EPA says that an ERC may be issued based on the same data and verification requirements used by existing tracking systems for issuing RECs, but the RECs are used for other regulatory requirements or for voluntary markets. EPA staff also has stated in a public forum at the National RPS Summit last fall that ERCs are not double counting RECs. Although both ERCs and RECs derive from the same megawatt hour, they are used in different ways and they represent different things. ERCs are only used to demonstrate compliance with the CPP, and they can't be used to demonstrate compliance with an RPS. Conversely, RECs are used to verify RPS compliance or voluntary environmental claim, but they can't be used to demonstrate compliance with the CPP. The effect of using an ERC is to reduce emissions at an affected EGU, whereas the effect of using RECs is to make a claim about using renewable energy or reducing one's indirect emissions responsibility from electricity. States with mass-based plans don't use ERCs for compliance. They use emission allowances. An allowance is a tradable instrument that represents an authorization to emit a ton of CO2 from an affected EGU. Under a mass-based plan, states measure performance by measuring total emissions at the generator smokestack, and at the end of a compliance period, an affected EGU must hold allowances equal in number to the tons of CO2 emissions it's released. The creation of allowances is based on the mass-based emission standard established for each state by EPA. If a state adopts a mass-based plan, it will have a mass emissions budget, or a cap, and it'll be given an equal number of emission allowances, or it'll be allowed to create an equal number of emission allowances. The state can determine how it will initially distribute the allowances, and any allowances not needed by the affected EGUs may be traded among them. Because the number of allowances issued is based on a budget, or tons, and not on generation or megawatt hours, there's not much difference between RECs and allowances, and we don't see much confusion occurring there. Let's go to the next slide, please. The Clean Power Plan requires states to designate a tracking system to verify progress toward their CPP emission goals. And EPA offers two possibilities: an EPA-administered tracking system that EPA will develop, or an EPA-approved tracking system that a state may propose. A state might be inclined to use the EPA-administered tracking system because it is by definition acceptable to EPA, and the state wouldn't need to propose and oversee its own tracking system. But the state will still be responsible for requesting and authorizing ERC issuance. And the EPA-administered tracking system will only track ERCs and allowances, and not RECs. So states with an RPS will still need a separate tracking system for RECs, a potential duplication of effort. To be issued RECs, eligible generators would have to continue reporting their generation to the REC tracking system, and to be issued ERCs, they'd have to report their generation to the EPA-administered ERC tracking system. This would create some duplicate measurement reporting and verification responsibilities. So, although ERC or allowance tracking in the EPA-administered tracking system might be convenient for states, maintaining and managing accounts in two systems will impose a financial and management cost on generators and other market participants, such as utilities and other load-serving entities that want both ERCs, or allowances, and RECs. But one thing I want to be very clear about is that even if a state chooses to rely on an existing tracking system for RECs and ERCs, the two instruments must be tracked separately because they use differently. Generators and load-serving entities that must comply with an RPS would probably need to maintain two separate accounts in the tracking system, one for RECs and one for ERCs. But regardless of how the tracking is done, the tracking of two separate instruments in parallel will require modification to the software for existing tracking systems. Now, there are some other implications for existing tracking systems that I want to mention if they are chosen for CPP compliance. One is that states that want to stick with their existing REC tracking system for issuing ERCs for renewable energy they'll need to decide whether they want their REC tracking system to issue ERCs, not just for renewable energy, but also for the broad range of ERC-eligible activities beyond renewable energy generation that can contribute to CPP goal achievement. Let's remember that these include energy efficiency, combined heat and power and waste heat and power, incremental nuclear, shifting from coal to gas, efficiencies undertaken by affected EGUs, and electricity transmission and distribution measures that improve the efficiency of the T&D system or reduce electricity use. So if states don't expand their REC tracking system capability to issue ERCs for more than just renewable energy, those states will need to consider other options for issuing and tracking the broader range of ERCs. In that case, they'd have to designate multiple tracking systems, which might be administratively challenging. Further, market participants, especially affected EGUs, would have to pay attention to ERC availability in multiple tracking systems serving a given state, and the transaction fees could then become duplicative. In states with rate-based plans, the CPP says the state or its designated agent will be responsible for issuing ERCs. States could therefore designate the entity that administers a tracking system as their designated agent to review the necessary project applications and measurement and verification prior to the issuance of ERCs on behalf of the state. Just one thing to think about. As to allowance tracking, allowances are created according to the mass emission budget for each state that submits a mass-based plan. As I've mentioned earlier, it's not based on generation from eligible resources, so there's no natural affinity for allowances to be tracked by existing REC tracking systems, except that states may prefer to deal with a regional issuer with whom they have an established relationship. The existing REC tracking system would have to be modified to track allowances. Without the need to rely on generation data for allowance creation, states might find it easier to choose either the EPA-administered tracking system or an existing allowance tracking system that would need to be approved by EPA. So to summarize tracking considerations, it seems likely to me that a state's choice of tracking system will be informed by whether a state proposes a rate-based plan or a mass-based plan. If a state proposes a rate-based plan, it will be dependent on reported megawatt hours for the creation of ERCs, and in this case, it could be advantageous to go with an existing REC tracking system because the same generation data could be used to create both ERCs and RECs. The generation data would have to be submitted and verified only once to the administrator of the tracking system. By comparison, mass-based states will rely on allowances, which aren't dependent on megawatt hours for their creation. They're just based on the mass emissions budget. Allowance tracking could therefore be done by any tracking system, but the EPA-administered system might have the advantage because it's pre-approved, or an existing allowance tracking system might be preferred over a REC tracking system that would have to undergo more significant modifications. With that, I'm going to stop here because I want to make sure we have time to answer questions. So Warren, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Hey, thanks very much, Ed. You really managed to cover a large amount of ground there in a short period of time, and this is complicated stuff, but you've made it as clear as I think is possible given those constraints. Now, we do have some questions here, and I will ask those, but I want to let folks on the line know that you should still keep typing in your questions because I don't have so many questions so far that we'll use up all the time with the ones that are currently in the queue. One question we got is, this goes to ERCs and RECs, and this person says, while ERCs may not be double counting RECs, is it going to be possible for a project to bring in revenue from the sale of both RECs and ERCs?
The answer is yes, because both an ERC and a REC can be issued for the same megawatt hour. If they are sold separately or together, they both have value in the marketplace. So yes, you could sell them both and earn value on behalf of both, based on the markets for both instruments.
Okay. And then this goes to sort of mass versus rate-based systems. Is it your sense that both of those systems allow for economic expansion without a penalty, or is it easier for a state economy to expand under one system rather than the other?
Yeah, I think that's the root of that question is really the basis for why EPA offered the two different approaches. So if there's a mass-based cap, it's a fixed cap, and if there's a lot of economic growth in a given state, it may be harder for the state to conduct its activity and generate all the electricity it needs within that fixed cap. Such a state might be more inclined to choose a rate-based approach, because as long as they keep the rate of emissions per megawatt hour below the standard, they can still grow economically. They can still have increased economic activity and increased consumption of electricity without worrying about the maximum emissions, but just worrying about the emission rate. And as I say, I think that's the appeal of the rate-based approach for states that are looking at significant growth and feel that they can't, or they would be at risk if they accepted a fixed cap.
Okay, thank you. You know, some states, and this is currently the case in Ohio, there are some legislators who are using the fact that there's currently a stay on the Clean Power Plan rule as a reason to propose a freeze to the RPS. Are there any reasons why a state might not want to freeze it or use the CPP stay as a reason to freeze its RPS?
Well, I mean, I think that any generation that is created by a power plant that begins operation beginning in 2013 or later is going to be available to help meet the CPP targets in the 2022 to 2030 compliance period. So if you put a hold on the growth of your RPS, it means that there's some uncertainty about investment in new projects, and if new projects don't materialize, then you're simply going to have less renewable generation that would be eligible for ERCs or to help displace affected EGUs. I don't see any advantage to holding back on your RPS because of the stay on the CPP. I mean, I assume that the RPS is being undertaken for its own public policy reasons that state legislators, have adopted, whether that's, their own desire to lower greenhouse gas emissions or improve public health or whatever. There are a number of environmental reasons and economic reasons for undertaking renewable energy investment. So even independent of the stay, even if the Clean Power Plan were to be judged not legal, I think states should be thinking about, well, what are their public policy goals, and be guided accordingly.
Thank you. Well, this next question maybe asks you to make some judgments that may not be that easy to make, and so you could beg off if you want. But let's assume there's an RPS administrator or a state policy maker who wants to ensure that the RPS is maximally leveraged for the purpose of CPP compliance. What's the best way to do that to ensure that, hey, we got this RPS already in place, we're moving forward with it, we want to make sure that it helps us as much as possible in terms of achieving compliance? How should they proceed?
Well, I guess I can think of maybe two different ways to interpret the question. If you're just trying to say, how can we get the most leverage out of our renewable energy investments or our RPS in helping us to comply with the CPP, assuming that it is judged to be legal and proceeds, goes forward accordingly, then I would think that you would want to just make sure that you encourage investment, whether it's through your RPS or through other means, that is built and in operation after, beginning in 2013 or later, because any of that output will be eligible to, at least in terms of a rate-based plan, to be issued ERCs that can be used to help your affected EGUs to meet their rate-based targets. And if you're in a state that wants to pursue a mast-based approach, the more you put on the grid, the more of the emitting generation will be displaced, the lower the overall emissions. So again, I don't know that there's any other magic trigger or rule or hurdle that needs to be met to make sure that that you're going to be helped in meeting your emissions targets. The other way that I might interpret that question is if you're saying, how do we maximize our RPS? If you think of that in the sense of not just helping to meet the CPP goals, but to actually have your RPS have a greater impact than what is required by the CPP, then there are some other policy options that you could consider that would say, we want that would make sure that your RPS is, so let's call it incremental to what's being required by federal law. I'm not sure that that's where the questioner is going, but that's another area that we could explore.
Okay. Here's an area where there's some uncertainty, and the questioner wonders if you have any views on this. Some people think, based on the reasoning from the Federal Trade Commission, that claims to REC ownership representing all environmental attributes will prohibit separating ERCs and selling them separately. Have you seen that argument, and do you think that's likely to become an issue?
I haven't seen the argument in voiced in terms of FTC requirements. All of the attributes of a REC are still intact, and anyone making a marketing claim, which is the focus of the FTC's interest, if they have the REC and they retire it, they should be okay. I have not seen any indication, at least not at this point, from the FTC that they are judging or making any judgment or making any, or even inviting the question about whether or not an ERC needs to be acquired and retired also. They could go there, but I haven't seen that. I think at this point the thinking is that an ERC doesn't have all these multiple attributes that a REC has. It is simply a compliance instrument. It's used only for the one purpose, the sole purpose of adjusting an affected EGU's emission rate, and therefore leading it to compliance with the rate-based emission standard. And I think that's really all I can say about that, because it's not something that I've seen discussed or really heard anything about at this point.
Okay, good. Well, there's one question that I'll ask, and then I'm going to answer it. And this person asked, are the states that have recently expanded their RPS targets, and there have been several, including Rhode Island now, and Oregon and California, and New York's moving in that direction, are those states doing that specifically to help with Clean Power Plan compliance, and have they made reference to Clean Power Plan when adopting those expansions? I think they haven't hinged it all that specifically on Clean Power Plan compliance, but in those states there's been a general sense that, look, the electricity systems needs to move in the direction of a cleaner system with lower greenhouse gas emissions. Expanding our RPS will help us do that. It'll likely have some positive implications for helping us meet and comply with the Clean Power Plan, but it's more of a general sense that this is the direction in which the electricity system needs to go. And then I will pass on somebody's comment here about the issue of the mass-based plan and fixed growth and economic growth. What this person's saying is emissions are capped, not growth, and your comments certainly were valid, but there are certainly ways in which an economy can expand without increasing its emissions.
Yeah,
someone else has.
I could just say that I appreciate the comment. It's very true. In making my response, I sort of fell back into the, I don't know, age-old trap of equating, economic growth with environmental impacts and neglecting to, adjust my mindset to recognize the fact that it's been demonstrated that, we can have economic growth with less electricity use. So energy efficiency, for example, plays a big role in helping us to grow even while we may be continuing to have economic growth.
Okay, good. Somebody asked if you could talk about the issues related to the voluntary market and how non-regulated entities can ensure that their investments meet a regulatory surplus requirement, and they're not in a situation by which their actions in the voluntary market only help the state meet its Clean Power Plan goal, but don't do anything more than that?
Yeah, great question. In fact, I wanted to talk about that, but I did not because of time. I wanted to allow for more questions. So I would say that for the purchase of a renewable megawatt hour to create incremental environmental benefits, it needs to lead to emission reductions or additional renewable energy beyond what's already required by government law and regulations. That's sometimes called regulatory surplus, but we know that the motivation in the voluntary market is generally and pretty strongly to make a difference above and beyond business as usual. So with CPP implementation, this applies mainly to states with that pursue a plan and issue ERCs. Even though ERCs and RECs are separate and distinct, and they don't claim the same attributes, they're still issued for the same megawatt hour. So the voluntary purchase of a REC won't lead to an incremental emission reductions if an ERC is also created and is used by an affected EGU for Clean Power Plan compliance, because the number of zero emission megawatt hours wouldn't have been increased beyond what the CPP is already requiring. So that means that participants in the voluntary market could pursue several strategies. They could, well, one way, they could buy renewable energy or RECs from generation that's not eligible for ERCs. For example, they could buy from generators that commenced operation before 2013. Or they could buy generation occurring up to 2022. Remember, it's only the generation that occurs in 2022 to 2030 that's going to be issued ERCs. So with the exception of the 2-year period for the Clean Energy Incentive Program in 2020-21. So they could have a strategy to sort of buy around or outside what is eligible for issuance of ERCs. A second option is they could buy renewable energy from generators with an accompanying attestation that no ERCs were produced with the purchased energy. And that could include on-site distributed generation. So, they could feel safe that they're making a difference by their purchase for this REC because that megawatt hour associated with that REC has not been issued an ERC. And these, just to be clear, these renewable generators or other clean energy producers, they don't automatically get issued ERCs the way we might automatically issue RECs to somebody. They have to apply for them. So they apply to the state and say, well, we produced this much, many megawatt hours. We would like to be issued ERCs, and that's reviewed, and then the ERCs may be issued. So they actually have to apply for it. So there could certainly be instances where generators are producing RECs but not ERCs. And then the third strategy is that the voluntary buyer could also buy ERCs to match their renewable energy purchases. They could buy RECs, and that's associated with a certain number of megawatt hours, and ERCs also associated with the same number of megawatt hours. Doesn't have to be from the same plant, although it certainly could be. And that way they could ensure that the ERCs that are associated with their purchases are not being used for compliance with a CPP. And any of these options would ensure that their REC purchase is incremental to the renewable energy used to satisfy both an RPS and the CPP.
Good. And could you also, on the voluntary market, explain how this would work in mass-based states, maybe using, the example of how the RGGI states have handled things?
Yes. So in a mass-based state, because we have allowances, let's say there's no other instrument being issued for renewable generation other than the RECs. So you're buying RECs, but if the state is under a cap, then there's still the same number of allowances available to emitting generators to meet the mass-based target. And one thing that that has been undertaken in the RGGI states, as well as in the California cap and trade program, is to create administratively through the state's rules, create a voluntary renewable energy set-aside that puts some allowances into that administrative account, and then based on a demonstration of the voluntary purchase of eligible renewable energy through certificates, an equivalent number, not the same number because the conversion factor isn't one-to-one, but an equivalent number of allowances in that set-aside account would be retired by the administrator on behalf of the voluntary purchaser. So the voluntary purchaser in that case is in effect is lowering the cap by taking some allowances out of circulation, and as I say, that has been demonstrated in 8 of the 9 RGGI states and also in California. So a state that wanted to pursue that under the CPP would say, okay, we have this many allowances under our cap, and here's how we're going to allocate them. We're going to put this number in a voluntary renewable energy set-aside of the allowances, and the remainder we're going to, maybe they're going to auction them off, or they can distribute them however they want. That's up to the state to decide. But this creating a set-aside for these allowances would be one key component. I want to note that EPA did mention the, if I recall correctly, I think it was an option. I don't think they directed it, but a state could to create what they called a renewable energy set-aside, which would be some of the allowances could be made available to renewable energy generators. So it's like an additional incentive. Those new renewable generators would get some allowances that they could then sell to make money. That would make those projects a little more profitable. This is what I've been talking about is different from that. This is what the EPA suggested was to provide that incentive to renewable energy generators. What I've been talking about is a set-aside that is for voluntary purchases of renewable energy so that the allowances are retired on behalf of those purchases. And that's a little different thing, and I just want to be clear about that.
Good. Well, I want to make an editorial comment. Then, Ed, I'll give you a minute or two to say anything else you would like to say you haven't had a chance to say so far. For those folks who haven't had their questions answered, I'd encourage you to write to Ed Holt on the screen there, and I'm sure he'd be happy to follow up with you. Well, my editorial comment is this stuff, when you listen to it, sounds remarkably complicated. It sounds mind-numbing, and you've made it as clear as it can be made. But I have 2 reasons to think it's not as bad as it seems at first, for 2 reasons. First of all, any individual state will only be dealing either with the mass-based rules or the rate-based rules. So after they make the decision there, they could forget about some of the other stuff. And then the second reason why I am somewhat reassured is that when RPSs were first being established and the whole system of RECs was coming in, that sounded remarkably complicated. It was hard to get one's arms around it and figured out all the different scenarios in which there would be confusion and complication. And we've worked that out, and the system now works pretty smoothly. So my assumption is that will happen here as well as we get some experience with the system in the real world. I want to thank you, Ed, for explaining this as well as you did. Do you have any last comments you want to share with the group?
Yeah, no, I'd like to second your perspective, Warren. It's yeah, it is very complicated. It will, as we become more familiar with it, as the rules become clearer, and the fact that the CPP will move forward, that will help clarify everyone's thinking as the states make their choices, their decisions. That will help simplify things. But a lot of buyers, and I guess I'm thinking now primarily from the voluntary market side, they'll have to be paying much closer attention to where they're making their purchases, whether they're making their purchase from a generator that's in a mass-based state or in a rate-based state. So that's a wrinkle that we'll have to pay a little more attention to, but I don't think it'll be as complicated as it feels right now. So thanks very much for the opportunity, Warren, and thank you all for listening to my presentation.
Thank you. And I want to give everybody a reminder that this presentation is based on an excellent report that Ed has done on this topic, and it's on our website, www.cisa.org. I look forward to seeing your names at least on future webinars, and we will be having more in the coming months. Thank you all.